I found out my husband had been stealing from me for over a year, and I found out at a dinner party, holding a glass of red wine, standing next to a woman whose name I had already forgotten. That is the part that still gets me. Not the betrayal itself, not the months of careful lies, not even the money. It is the casualness of it. The fact that Marcus was standing maybe 10 feet away from me, laughing at something someone said, and the words just drifted over like smoke. She still has no idea about the account. He was not whispering. He was not even trying to be quiet. He said it the way you say something when you are completely certain the other person is not really in the room. And the worst part, the part I have turned over in my mind 100 times since, is that he was right. I had been standing in that marriage for years without really being in it. I had been present in body, busy with work, busy with building something, busy with all the things that feel urgent until they suddenly are not. And Marcus had used that busyness the way a contractor uses scaffolding. Something to lean on while he built something I was never meant to see. I remember the exact feeling of that moment. The wine in my hand went warm without me drinking it. The conversation around me turned into a kind of background hum, like a television left on in another room. I did not look at him. I did not move. I just stood there and let the words settle into me slowly, the way cold water rises. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, he thinks he is safe. He has thought that for a long time. That thought did not make me angry. Not yet. What it made me was still. A specific kind of still that I had never quite felt before. The kind that is not shock and is not calm, but is somewhere between the two, where your mind starts moving very fast and your body stays completely quiet. I smiled at the woman next to me. I asked her something about her work. I laughed at the right moment. And the whole time, underneath all of it, something in me was already beginning to change direction. I drove home that night alone, Marcus following in his car behind me, his headlights visible in my mirror the entire way. I watched them, and I thought about how long I had been looking at the reflection of this man and mistaking it for the real thing. If this story is already hitting close to home for you, stay with me because it gets much deeper. And if you know someone who needs to hear something like this, share it with them. It might matter more than you think. Like and subscribe if you want to keep following this story. It genuinely helps more than you know. Marcus and I had met when I was still figuring out what I wanted my life to look like. I was freelancing, scraping together contracts, working from a spare bedroom that smelled like old coffee and printer ink. He was in commercial real estate, confident in the way that people are confident when things have always more or less worked out for them. He ordered for the table without asking. He knew the name of every waiter. He had opinions about wine that he shared without being asked, and somehow it never felt arrogant, it just felt like certainty. And I was young enough and uncertain enough to find that certainty beautiful. We built a life together the way most people do, gradually, practically, one shared decision at a time. A joint account here, a shared lease there, small financial threads woven together until neither of us could quite remember which money was whose. And that was fine. For a long time, that was more than fine. Because I trusted him the way you trust the floor beneath your feet. Not because you have tested it, just because it has always held. Then one morning, I slid a piece of paper across the breakfast counter, and everything quietly cracked. It was a job offer. The number on it was bigger than anything I had earned before, bigger than what Marcus made that year. And I watched him read it the way you watch someone open a door they were not expecting to find unlocked. He read it once, then again. Then he folded it along the original crease with this small, careful precision that I remember thinking was odd. And he said, "That is a big jump." Not, "I am proud of you." Not, "This is incredible." Just that. A quiet, measured assessment, like a man calculating something privately, while keeping his expression perfectly neutral. I told myself he was surprised. I told myself he needed time to process it. I took the job, threw myself into it completely, and within months the income was real and growing and undeniable. And Marcus became almost overnight extraordinarily helpful. He started managing things: the household budget, the shared savings, the investment account. "You focus on the big picture," he would say, lifting statements from my hands with a smile that I now understand was not warmth. It was relief. The relief of a man who had just realized that the more successful I became, the less time I would have to look at the details. And he was right about that too, for a while. The money had been disappearing for months, and I had been too busy earning it to notice. That is the sentence I keep coming back to, the one that sits in my chest like something I swallowed wrong. Because it was not a small amount. By the time I actually looked, really looked, with fresh eyes and a stomach full of dread, the total across all those quiet little transfers added up to something that made my hands go cold on the keyboard. Round numbers, every single one. Never an odd amount, never anything that looked accidental or impulsive. Just clean, deliberate figures, moved with the kind of patience that takes planning. And they all started, every single one of them, within 3 weeks of the morning I slid that job offer across the breakfast counter and watched Marcus fold it along its crease without saying congratulations. I had gone back to request paper statements because I told Marcus the app was glitching on my phone. That part was a small lie, maybe the first real one I had told him in years, and I noticed how easily it came out, how naturally, which told me something about where I already was without fully admitting it to myself. The statements arrived in a plain envelope, and I opened them at the kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon while Marcus was at a showing across town. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint sound of traffic 6 floors below, that low, continuous hum that you stop hearing after a while, but notice again when everything else goes still. I spread the pages out slowly, and I started at the beginning, working forward month by month, and for the first few pages, everything looked exactly the way it always had. Groceries, utilities, the gym membership neither of us used anymore, a restaurant here and there. Normal, unremarkable. The kind of financial life that belongs to 2 people who are not paying close enough attention. And then there it was, a transfer to an account I did not recognize. The number was not enormous, it was actually modest enough to dismiss if you were only half looking. But I was fully looking now. I wrote it down on the corner of a notepad I found in the kitchen drawer. Then I turned the page and found another one, same destination account, different date, slightly different amount. I wrote that one down too. By the time I reached the most recent statement, my notepad had 7 entries, and my coffee had gone completely cold. I sat with those 7 numbers for a long time, adding them up in my head twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the result. It did not. What I was looking at was not a mistake or a forgotten subscription or a payment I had approved and forgotten about. What I was looking at was a pattern, and patterns do not happen by accident. They happen because someone made a series of decisions, one after another, and trusted that nobody was watching. The thing about discovering something like that is it does not feel the way you expect it to. I had always assumed that a moment of real betrayal would arrive with noise, with heat, with the kind of emotion that breaks things. But sitting there at that kitchen table with those 7 numbers on my notepad and the winter light coming flat and gray through the window, what I felt was something much quieter and in some ways much worse. It was recognition. The specific, sickening feeling of seeing something clearly for the first time and understanding that it has been true for much longer than you knew. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I folded the statements back into the envelope the same way Marcus had folded that job offer, carefully, along the existing crease, and I put them in my bag. Then I washed my coffee cup, dried it, put it back in the cabinet, and went to my desk to finish the proposal I had been working on before the envelope arrived. Because that is the thing nobody tells you about this kind of moment. Life does not pause for it. The work still exists. The deadlines are still real. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep moving while you decide what to do next. It was 2 days later that Claire called. Marcus's sister, warm and a little scattered, the kind of person who fills silence with whatever is nearest to the surface of her mind. We had always gotten along. Easy Sunday lunches, the occasional message about nothing important. She called to ask if I had heard from Marcus recently because he had been a little distant with the family. And then, the way people do when they are not being careful, she added something almost as an afterthought. She hoped his new project was going well, she said. She knew how much was riding on it. I kept my voice completely level. I told her I had been buried in work and asked her what she meant. There was a pause on her end, a small hesitation that lasted just long enough to tell me everything. "Oh," she said slowly. "I thought you knew." And in that moment, those 4 words told me more than any bank statement ever could. Her name was Petra, and she had been at our wedding. I found that out on a Tuesday morning, sitting cross-legged on the bathroom floor with my laptop open. Because something about being in a smaller room made the whole thing feel more contained, more manageable, like the walls could hold what I was about to find. I had run a public business search the night before, just typing the account number fragment I had managed to piece together from the statements into every search tool I could find, cross-referencing names, addresses, registration dates, the kind of slow, methodical work that feels almost meditative until it suddenly is not. And there it was, a small, registered business, a consulting firm with a name bland enough to forget immediately, listed under Petra Calloway. I knew that name. I had heard it maybe a dozen times over the years, always in passing, always attached to some work story of Marcus's. I had met her twice, once at a company event where she had shaken my hand and told me I had a beautiful coat, and once at our wedding, somewhere near the back, someone's +1, a face I had registered and then filed away as unimportant. The registration date on that business was almost exactly 3 weeks after the morning Marcus folded my job offer along its crease and said nothing worth remembering. I sat on that bathroom floor for a long time without moving. The tiles were cold through my clothes, and the tap was dripping somewhere behind me, that slow, irregular tick that you only notice when everything else in your life has gone completely silent. I did not feel what I expected to feel. There was no explosion of emotion, no immediate wave of grief or fury. What I felt was closer to the sensation of finally understanding a sentence you have read 10 times without it making sense. Everything clicked into place at once, quietly, almost gently, and the gentleness of it was the most unsettling part. Marcus had not started something new when my income grew. He had accelerated something that already existed. The transfers, the helpful management of our accounts, the way he lifted financial statements from my hands with that warm, practiced smile, none of that was a response to my success. It was a system that had been waiting for the right conditions, and my success had simply given him the perfect cover. More money coming in meant more movement to hide things inside. I closed the laptop and pressed my back against the cold edge of the bathtub and thought about the woman who had told me at my own wedding that she liked my coat. And I understood that some betrayals do not arrive like a wave. They arrive like water under a door, slow and silent. And by the time you feel it, the floor is already ruined. That understanding changed something in me, and the change was not what I would have predicted. I had always thought of myself as someone who reacted emotionally first and thought clearly second, someone who needed time to process before acting. But something about the scale of what I was looking at seemed to bypass all of that and land directly in a part of me that was cooler and more precise than I knew I had. I did not want to confront Marcus, not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because I understood with sudden clarity that a confrontation was exactly what he would be able to manage. Marcus was extraordinary in a room where feelings were the main currency. He was warm, articulate, persuasive, the kind of man who could reframe almost any situation while you were still finding words for what you felt. If I walked into that apartment and told him what I knew, I would be handing him the one advantage he needed. I would be giving him time to construct a response while I was still bleeding from the question. So I made a different choice. I decided to move first and speak second. I called a financial advisor the next morning, someone a colleague had mentioned once at a lunch I almost did not attend, and I sat in her office for 90 minutes with the paper statements in my bag and explained the situation in the flattest, most factual language I could manage. She listened without interrupting, asked 3 very specific questions at the end, and then told me exactly what I needed to do and in what order. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Not to file anything, not yet, just to understand the shape of the ground I was standing on, to know which parts were solid and which parts Marcus had been quietly hollowing out beneath me. And then I went home, made dinner, asked Marcus about his day, listened to his answer, and felt, for the first time in this marriage, like the most prepared person in the room. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved my direct deposits into a personal account I opened alone, on a lunch break, at a branch on the other side of town from anywhere Marcus and I usually went. I sat at the desk in our spare bedroom late at night, the same desk where I had built my practice from nothing, and I went through every shared financial instrument we had with the same focused attention I gave my best clients. And every morning I woke up, made coffee, handed Marcus his cup, and smiled. Because here is the thing about being underestimated for a long time. When you finally decide to stop being underestimated, you already have a head start. What Marcus did not know, could not have known, was that while he was managing the details of our financial life with one hand, I had already started building something he could not touch with the other. And I was almost ready to show him exactly what that looked like. The document that finally broke everything open was not a bank statement or a business registration. It was a lease agreement I found completely by accident, printed and folded inside the sleeve of a travel folder Marcus kept on the shelf in our spare bedroom, the same shelf where I had been sitting late at night going through our financial records for 2 weeks straight. I was not looking for it. I was reaching for a pen that had rolled behind the folder, and the papers slipped out onto the desk in front of me, and there it was, a residential lease, a 1-bedroom apartment across town, signed in Marcus's name, dated 4 months ago. 4 months. I sat there, holding it under the desk lamp with both hands, and read every line twice, the way you read something when your brain keeps refusing to fully process what your eyes are clearly seeing. The address meant nothing to me at first, just a street name in a part of the city I rarely went to. But the date on the signature line hit me somewhere specific and immediate, because 4 months ago, Marcus and I had spent a weekend away together, a short trip he had suggested, a hotel by the water, long dinners, the kind of easy closeness that felt like a reset. I had come home from that trip thinking that something between us had shifted back toward something good. He had come home from that trip to an apartment he was already paying for somewhere else. I set the lease down on the desk very carefully, as if it were something that might break, though I understood dimly that it was already the most broken thing in the room. Then I sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling, and breathed slowly for a long moment. Not because I was falling apart, because I needed to think clearly, and I had learned over the past 2 weeks that clear thinking required space, even just a few seconds of it before the next move, because there was always a next move now. That was the thing that had changed most fundamentally in me since I started preparing. I no longer felt like someone waiting to see what would happen. I felt like someone who was deciding. I photographed every page of the lease with my phone, sent the images to my own email, then refolded the papers exactly as they had been and slid them back inside the folder sleeve. I pushed the folder back to its original position on the shelf. Then I went to bed. Marcus was already asleep. I lay next to him in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about the apartment across town, about what it represented. Not just the money or the planning or the other person almost certainly connected to it, but the sheer sustained effort of maintaining 2 lives simultaneously. How exhausting it must have been. How certain he must have felt that I would never look closely enough to find any of it. I chose a Tuesday. There was nothing special about Tuesdays in our life. No standing plans, no particular rhythm that made it notable. That was exactly why I chose it. Marcus left that morning the way he always did, keys in hand, a coffee he took 2 sips of before leaving it on the counter, a kiss on my cheek that landed slightly to the side the way it always did. I watched him go from the kitchen window, and then I stood there for a full minute after his car disappeared, just looking at the empty street below, feeling the particular weight of a decision that has already been made settling into my body like something solid. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with my phone, my notepad, and the paper statements in their envelope, and I started making calls. The financial advisor first. She had been expecting to hear from me, and she moved quickly, asking focused questions, walking me through the next steps in the flat, efficient language of someone who had done this before, and understood that the person on the other end of the call needed clarity more than comfort. I flagged every shared account. I initiated a legal review of the joint investment fund. I provided documentation of the transfers to the external account and the business registration in Petra's name. Everything I had gathered quietly over 2 weeks while making coffee and asking Marcus about his day, and sleeping 6 inches away from a man who had an apartment I had never seen. Then I called the lawyer. The conversation was shorter this time because the groundwork was already laid. She told me the lease I had photographed was significant. She told me the pattern of transfers was significant. She told me I had done almost everything right, and that the timing of what came next would matter enormously. "Do not tell him yet," she said. "Let the process move first. Let the documentation speak before he has a chance to respond to it." I hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment. The coffee Marcus had left on the counter was still there, half full and cold. I picked it up and poured it down the sink and washed the cup and put it away. Then I opened my laptop and went back to the proposal I had been working on for a client, because the work was still real and the deadline still existed, and somewhere in the middle of all of this, I had not missed a single one. When Marcus came home that evening, I had dinner ready. I asked about his day. He told me about a property showing that had gone well, a couple who seemed serious, a deal that might close before the end of the month. He was relaxed, easy, the version of himself he wore at home when he believed everything was still in its place. And I sat across from him and listened and smiled and thought about the lawyer's advice and the flagged accounts and the documents already in motion, and I understood something that I could not have understood a month ago. I was no longer in the same story he thought we were both living. I had already stepped into a different one. And tomorrow, he was going to find out exactly where I had been. He found out everything was gone before I said a single word. That is the part I did not plan, but it happened better than anything I could have scripted. Marcus came home the next evening at his usual time, dropped his keys on the entry table the way he always did, and walked into the kitchen where I was standing with a cup of tea I had made mostly just to have something warm to hold. He looked normal, relaxed, the version of himself he had been performing so consistently for months that I wondered sometimes if he had forgotten it was a performance at all. He reached into his jacket pocket for his phone and stopped. His hand stayed in that pocket for just a second too long, and I watched his face change the way a sky changes before rain, not all at once, but in a shift of light that tells you everything before the first drop falls. He pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. Then he looked at me. Something had come through on his banking app, a notification, the kind that tells you an account has been flagged and access has been restricted pending legal review. I had not timed it deliberately. I had not arranged for it to happen at that exact moment, in that exact room, with me standing 3 feet away holding a cup of tea. But sometimes the details arrange themselves better than you could have planned, and all you have to do is be present enough to let it happen. He set the phone down on the counter very slowly, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. Then he said my name. Not as a question, not as an accusation, just as a word he needed to say out loud to confirm I was really there. "I am," I said. He looked at the phone again, then back at me. "What did you do?" he said. His voice was lower than usual, and there was something in it I had not heard before, something careful and slightly unsteady, like a man who has just realized the floor he is standing on has been shifting for weeks, and he is only now feeling it move. I did not answer immediately. I took a sip of my tea. I set it down on the counter beside his phone. And then I told him, calmly and in specific detail, exactly what I had done. The statements, the financial advisor, the lawyer, the flagged accounts, the legal review of the joint investments, all of it, in the same flat, factual language I had used in every phone call and every meeting over the past 2 weeks. I watched him listen. I watched him try to find the edge of it, the place where it stopped, where there was still something he could reach and redirect and manage. There was no such place. And the moment he understood that, something in his posture changed completely. The conversation that followed was not what either of us would have expected a month ago. There was no shouting, no dramatic moment where everything shattered. What happened instead was something quieter, and in many ways more final. Marcus sat down at the kitchen table, which he almost never did unless we were eating, and he looked at the surface of it for a long moment before he spoke. He asked how long I had known. I told him about the dinner party, about the words that floated across the room while he laughed with someone else, about standing there holding a glass of warm wine and feeling the ground shift beneath a version of my life I had not yet understood was already ending. He closed his eyes when I said that, just briefly. Then he opened them and asked about Petra. I told him I knew about the business. I knew about the transfers. I knew about the lease on the apartment across town, the one he had signed 4 months ago while we were planning a weekend away together. He did not ask how I found the lease. Maybe he understood by then that the question no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had, and that I had said nothing, and that while he had been maintaining a careful performance of an ordinary marriage, I had been working, quietly, methodically, without giving him a single thing to respond to. The documentation speaks for itself, my lawyer had said, and it did. What Marcus said next surprised me. Not because it was kind, it was not particularly kind, but because it was honest in a way he had not been in a very long time. He said he had told himself it was not really taking anything, that the money he had moved was a kind of insurance, something to fall back on if things changed, if the balance between us kept shifting in a direction he could not figure out how to live with. He said he had not known how to be in a marriage where he was no longer the one holding everything together. He said that out loud, sitting at our kitchen table, and I listened to every word of it and felt something unexpected. Not softness exactly, but a kind of understanding that did not excuse anything and did not change anything, but sat there in the room with us like a third presence. Because here is what I had come to understand through all of this, something I could not have put into words at the beginning, but could say clearly now. Marcus had confused being needed with being valued. He had spent years building a version of our life where his role was to manage and provide and decide. And when that version stopped being necessary, he did not know how to find his place in the new one. So instead of asking, instead of adjusting, instead of simply being honest, he had tried to quietly extract himself before the thing he feared most could happen, before I outgrew the structure he had built around both of us. The divorce was not a war, it was an accounting. And because I had prepared with the same precision I brought to everything I had ever built professionally, the accounting was fair. The money that had been moved was documented and returned through the legal process. The business registered in Petra's name was dissolved within 2 months. Marcus moved into the apartment across town, the one he had been paying for all along. And I stayed in the place we had chosen together, the one my income had been sustaining for over a year without either of us saying it out loud. Some mornings, I sit at the desk in the spare bedroom, the same desk where I found the lease, where I spread out the statements, where I made every call that changed the direction of my life, and I think about what it took to get here. Not the confrontation, not the legal process, but the moment I decided to stop being the person who trusted the floor without ever once checking what it was built on. That is the thing I would want anyone to take from this. You do not have to be loud to be powerful. You do not have to perform your strength for anyone. But you have to be awake inside your own life, paying attention, asking questions, understanding where you stand and what is actually yours. Because nobody else is going to do that for you. And the moment you start doing it for yourself, everything changes. Now, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. If you found out today that someone you completely trusted had been quietly building a way out behind your back, what would be the very first thing you would do? Not what you think you should do, what you would actually do. Leave your answer below, because I think this conversation matters more than most. And if this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar or made you think, please like this video and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming, and every single one of them is worth hearing.